بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We praise Allah, the Lord of all of creation, and send blessings and peace upon the most honorable of prophets and messengers, our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and all of his followers and companions. Amma ba'd. So this is the second part of the introductory series of Al-Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyyah, principles of jurisprudence. Last time we only talked about definitions. We mentioned definitions, and which, by the way, are extremely important. Definitions, they say al-haddu aslu kulli ilm. That's what they say. Definitions are the basis of every knowledge or understanding every knowledge. Because with definitions, you can picture the issue or the topic at hand. You could picture what's it about, what the topic is about, what comes under it, what doesn't, and so on. So that's why a good teacher should have a section for definitions before delving and explaining the topic. This way, it'll be easier for the students to understand what is being taught or told. So we talked about definitions, we defined fiqh, and we defined qawaid, and then we put or defined both of them together. And now we will be mentioning the types or categories of al-qawaid al-fiqhiyyah, because the principles aren't all in the same level. There are categories, there are types, and we'll be discussing them inshallah in this video. And in the next video, inshallah, we'll be talking about where it's been taken from, where the principles are taken from. As in, for example, if we say a principle is this, where did we take this from? And the benefits of learning this science. Because someone could come and say, what's the point of me learning this science? What's the point of learning these principles, memorizing them? What am I going to benefit or gain from them? Why should I spend time learning them, and so on? So we'll be addressing that in the next video, inshallah. So let's start by explaining the types of al-qawaid al-fiqhiyyah. For categorizing the qawaid, as in mentioning the types, we can categorize them from different aspects, three different aspects. From the aspect of its application, from the aspect of its acceptance, and from the aspect of its originality. So the first one, application. What does application mean? It means how widely is this principle used? Does it encompass or cover many fiqh issues and chapters, or only a few? So in terms of application, it's categorized into three. The first one, principles that cover numerous issues from various chapters. So we're not talking about principles that are, for example, cover only one chapter. Like, for example, tahara, purity. These principles don't only cover purity or only cover salah, the chapter of salah. No, it covers many vast or a lot of chapters like purity, salah, zakah, marriage, nikah, talaq, divorce, transactions, hajj, fasting, and so on. So these principles cover numerous issues under various chapters, and they are like al-qawaid al-khams al-kubra, or al-qawaid al-khams al-kubra, the five major principles, which are the ones, by the way, are the ones that we're going to be explaining in the poem, inshallah. From them, al-umuru bimaqasidiha, we mentioned it in the previous video, if you guys remember. And al-umuru bimaqasidiha, actions are by their intentions, or a better wording, innama al-a'malu bin-niyyat. This principle covers numerous fiqh issues from various chapters of fiqh, like purity, mentioned before, like purity, zakah, salah, transactions, marriage, and so on, capital punishments, and so on. We gave an example in the previous video. So that's number one, principles that cover numerous issues from various chapters. Two, principles that cover or encompass many issues but are fewer in number than the previous one. So this one is basically like the first one, but in terms of application, it is fewer. Principles that encompass many issues, but are fewer in number, application-wise, than the previous one. For example, الإيثار في القرب مكروه وفي غيرها محبوب. This is a principle that's mentioned by Suyuti. Suyuti mentions this principle in his book called Al-Ashbah wa Nadair. And what this principle means is that favoring others in acts of worship is hated. But other than that, it is beloved. What does it mean? It means, oh, by the way, we're talking about acts of worship that can be shared by other people. As in, numerous people can do it at the same time. Only one person, or only maybe a group of people could do it, but not numerous people. For example, giving the adhan. The adhan, only one person can do it. So for that person, which is the mu'adhin, the one giving the adhan, to give up his position for someone else is hated, because it's an act of worship and we were commanded to rush towards good. So favoring another person over yourself in acts of worship is hated. Same with if you're an imam, for example, you're leading the salah and you are qualified to lead. We're not talking about if you're not qualified, no, you're qualified to lead. It is hated for you to leave that position and make someone else lead the salah. And of course, there are exceptions. For example, it could be for da'wah purposes. You do it for da'wah purposes, or getting closer to a person that's between you and him kind of animosity or hatred. So you're doing this in turn so that he'll be more open up or more open to you, and so on. So there are kind of exceptions, but this is a general principle. Favoring others in acts of worship is hated. And other than the acts of worship, then it is beloved. If it's other than the acts of worship, it is beloved. Just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the Ansar, praising them for this attribute, He says, وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. They give, yani the Muhajirin, the Ansar give the Muhajirin preference over themselves, even though they may be in need. And since Allah praised this characteristic, it means that it is something beloved to Him and that we should have it, emulate it. Allah also says, ويطعمون الطعام على حبه مسكينا ويتيما وأسيرا إنما نطعمكم لوجه الله لا نريد منكم جزاء ولا شكورا. And they give food despite their love for it, their desire for it, to the poor, the orphan, and the captive. We feed you only for the sake of Allah, seeking neither reward nor thanks from you. So they're favoring those people over themselves by giving them food even though they love it. And many other examples in the Quran and the Sunnah. So anyways, the point of mentioning these principles, like the one just mentioned, الإيثار في القرى بمكروه وفي غيرها محبوب, is to show that there are principles that are encompassing, but some are more than others. The 5 major principles encompass more issues than this one just mentioned. And the third one, principles that cover a few specific issues. So this one, in terms of its application, is the one that encompasses the least or covers the least amount of issues. An example of this type is the principle الدفع أولى من الرفع. It means that preventing something from happening is better than removing it after it happened. And actually, what's unique about this principle over others is that it doesn't only apply in the Sharia or the Deen. It is something could apply in life. It's a general rule that you apply in life. It will save you a lot of trouble. Preventing something is far better than removing it after it happened. For example, in life, preventing or protecting yourself from a disease is better than waiting for it to happen, and thus having to do surgery or going to the hospital to get medical treatment, and then you have to pay all those fees. Another example is a car. Maintaining a car is far better than neglecting the car, and thus the car in the future there will be issues with the car and you have to take it to the mechanic and fix the issues and whatnot. So it's far better to maintain the car and save yourself the headache than waiting for it or waiting for something bad to happen. So those are examples of life. You could apply this rule in life. You could apply it in life. It's a good rule to apply. As for the Sharia, an example in the Sharia is preventing someone from taking ghusl, whether it be from janaba or just to clean oneself, in stagnant water. Preventing someone from cleaning themselves in stagnant water. Why? Because this water doesn't run, right? Stagnant water is water that doesn't run. It stays still. So someone doing ghusl, cleaning himself in that water might cause the water to be affected over time and making it dirty. So it's better to prevent this than waiting for it to happen and thus needing to clean the water. Or someone might need to use the water for drinking when there aren't any other options for him to use. So he'll be drinking from dirty water. which might poison him, or he might be, harmed because of it. So these are the three types of categories when it comes to application. Principles that cover numerous issues from various chapters, principles that cover many issues as well, but are fewer in number than the previous one, and the third one is the least one in terms of application. So these are the three types when it comes to application. As for the third type, which is acceptance, in terms of its acceptance, what does it mean? It means how accepted is this principle between the scholars. So in terms of its acceptance, is categorized into three as well. First one, principles that are agreed upon between the madahib, all of the madahib, as in all the scholars from the different schools of thought agree on these principles, even though they might differ in the way of its application, but they agree that, oh, this is a principle. Yani scholars from the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, the Hanbali madhab, they agree that this is a principle, even though they might differ in its application. An example is the five major principles, the Al-Qawaid Al-Khams Al-Kubra. And this shows you that how important these five principles are. And it's also going to be mentioned again in the third type of categorization. It's also going to be mentioned there. So it just shows you how major these principles are and how beneficial and how crucial it is to know them. So the poem that we're going to take is extremely beneficial, especially for someone who doesn't really study fiqh that much. Maybe he'll study some things here and there, he'll hear something here and there, but he can't study, for example, books, or can't memorize a hadith of fiqh or ayat al-ahkam, ayat relating to rulings. So these principles would save someone so much time. And for someone who can't do all of these stuff, if he suffices himself with these principles, then he would have achieved a lot. So this just shows you how crucial these five principles are, and they're the principles that are derived from them, which I'm going to mention them in the third categorization. So anyways, like I mentioned, in terms of its acceptance, principles that are agreed upon between the madahib, like the five major principles, all the madahib agree on. Second one, principles that are agreed upon in a certain madhab. Not all the madhab, but a certain madhab. For example, like the Shafi'i madhab, As-Suyuti mentions in his book, the one that I mentioned before, Al-Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir. This is a Shafi'i book because As-Suyuti is a Shafi'i. He's a Shafi'i, and his book, Al-Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir, is a Shafi'i book. He wrote it about the principles in the Shafi'i madhab. So anyways, As-Suyuti in his Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir mentions a principle, which is the one that we mentioned before, الإيثار في القرب مكروه وفي غيرها محبوب. This principle is agreed upon in the Shafi'i madhab. Scholars of the Shafi'iyya agree that this is a principle in the madhab, accepted principle in the madhab. As for the third type, principles that are differed upon in a certain madhab. So in that madhab, scholars differ upon should that be as a principle or not. Some scholars say yes, this is a principle, and some other scholars in that same madhab, they say no, it's not a principle, it doesn't count. From it is the one mentioned by Suyuti in his book, again in the same book. He mentions this principle that the Shafi'iyya differed upon. Is it a principle or not? فرض الكفاية هل يلزم بالشروع أو لا? Must you continue with فرض الكفاية or not? And the meaning of this principle, I'll try to explain it briefly. So if you don't get it, it's fine. Since the point isn't explaining these principles, the point is giving examples for each category. So when it comes to commands, whatever Allah commands, whatever the Prophet ﷺ commands, they are categorized into two: fardu ayn or fardu kifaya. Fardu ayn, it means that it is ordered from everyone to do it. Fardu kifaya means if a group of people do it, then the others don't have to do it. For example, Fardul Ain, for example, is praying the 5 salawat. Every person, every Muslim has to pray the 5 salawat. It's not like if 10 people do it, then the others don't have to do it. If the majority of Muslims pray, it doesn't mean that the others don't have to pray. No, it is a must, an obligation on every single Muslim. This is Fardul Ain. It is an obligation on every single person. As for Fardul Kifaya, it is an obligation on a group of Muslims that if they do it, the others don't have to do it. So if no one does Fardul Kifaya, then everyone is sinning. until these group of Muslims, yani certain groups of Muslim or number of Muslims do that action, then it is not a must on others to do it as well. An example of this one is the adhan. The adhan, let's say 5 people are in the masjid. The time of salah, let's say Asha, has come. It is, if no one gives the adhan from these 5 men in the masjid, if no one gives the adhan, then all of them are sinning. If one of them gives the adhan, then no one is sinning. Yani he is getting, the one who gives the adhan is rewarded, and the other 4 aren't sinning. But if no one gives the adhan, all 5 of them are sinning. So this is fardu kifaya. Adhan, giving adhan is fardu kifaya. And from fardu kifaya is also al-janaiz, salatul janaza, funeral prayer. It is fardu kifaya. So if a group of Muslims, certain number of Muslims do salatul janaza, then the others won't be sinning. So this is the difference between fardul ain and fardul kifaya. So the ruling here, or the principle that says that's differed upon, fardul kifaya هل يلزم بالشروع أو لا? As in, if you start fardul kifaya, is it a must that you continue with it, or can you stop midway? For example, let's give an example of what you mentioned, funeral prayer. Prayer, let's say you come and you're with the group of Muslims that are gonna do the funeral prayer. So you say Allah Akbar and start the prayer with the other people. Other people, let's say 20, 40 people also join. This is beyond fardu kifaya, yani it is suffices. This number suffices. So if you yourself weren't there, it still be fardu kifaya, as in it will still be, the number still sufficient. So you don't have to, so it wouldn't be sin. If you weren't there, you wouldn't be sinning because the number is already sufficient. So you being there or not there won't affect, okay? So if someone starts fardu kifaya and the number is sufficient now, can someone stop midway? For example, I'm praying. Let's say there are 5 people. Let's say, for example, someone died. For example, we want to pray a funeral prayer. And let's say 10 people. Let's say 10 people. We're praying. You say Allah Akbar. We say praying the funeral prayer. Let's say 30 people join. 30 people, 40 people join the funeral prayer. So can I leave now? And if I'm in the middle of salah, is it permissible for me to leave, or is it a must that I continue with fardul kifaya or with this fard? Because when I started, it was an obligation, but now enough people joined in, and now it's not obligation. So should I continue with it? Is it an obligation on me to continue with it, or can I stop midway and just leave? So this is differed upon, and like I said, if you don't understand what this means, it's fine, because that's not the point, but I just explained it briefly. So this is what it means, فرض الكفاية هل يلزم بالشروع أو لا. This is a principle or يعني a matter that's differed upon in the madhab. So anyways, these are the categories when it comes to its application. No, not application, acceptance between the scholars. And lastly, in terms of it being original or derivative, we mentioned the third type. In terms of its originality, we mean by it, in terms of it being original or derivative, we have 2 types. First one, principles or primary principles which are not derived from another principle. And the example of this category is the 5 major principles. Al-Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyyah, again, the 5 major principles. And in general, most rules or principles fall under this category because the majority of them are fall under this one, primary principles. The second one, derivative principles. These are derived from another principle. So you get this principle, this rule, from another principle. And this can occur in 2 ways. One, branching from a larger principle, yani that principle is taking or is branched from a larger principle. 2, it acts as a restriction or a constraint for another principle. So this principle is called a derivative principle. If it's A, branching from a larger principle, or B, it acts as a restriction for another principle, qaida. And to furthermore elaborate on the second one, derivative principles that are derived from another principle, we mentioned A, branching from a larger principle. An example of it, الأصل بقاء ما كان عليه. The original state remains unchanged. That is, if something is in a certain state, that then it is unchanged until there is evidence that it has been changed. So whatever state it is in, it remains in that state until proven otherwise, or until something happens to it that changes it or takes it from that state to another state. And we'll elaborate more on it since it's going to be in the poem. All of these actually, except the last one, I believe, it's not mentioned. الرخص لا تناط بالمعاصي. It's not mentioned in the poem. But anyways, this one, الأصل بقاء ما كان عليه. The original state remains unchanged. And there's also another one, الأصل براءة الذمة. براءة الذمة. الأصل براءة الذمة. The default state is that someone is free from whatever he's charged with until proven otherwise. That is basically innocent until proven guilty, basically. So these two principles are derived from the principle اليقين لا يزول بالشك. Certainty is not removed by doubt. Oh, by the way, also الأصل براءة الذمة, the one that I mentioned before, the default state is that someone is free from whatever he's charged with until proven otherwise. That is innocent until proven guilty, is also in the poem. We're going to be discussing it, inshallah. So anyways, this one, الأصل بقاء ما كان عليه, this one, and الأصل براءة الذمة, these two are derived from the principle اليقين لا يزول بالشك. Certainty is not removed by doubt. So these are derivative principles because they're taken from the original, the primary principle, اليقين لا يزول بالشك, and this is one of the 5 principles. Certainty is not removed by doubt. B, the second one, what makes a principle a derivative and not a primary, if it acts as a restraint or as a restriction or constraint for another principle. For example, الضرر لا يزال بالضرر. Harm is not removed by another harm. Harm is not removed by harm, which is a restriction of the broader principle الضرر يزال. الضرر يزال is one of the 5 principles. Harm to be removed. يعني whatever harm there is, it is to be removed. Harm is to be removed. الضرر يزال. So harm to be removed. So if someone only sees that principle, harm to be removed, someone might understand from the principle that harm, it is permissible to remove this harm with another harm. So if there's a harm, it is fine for me to remove this harm with another harm. But that isn't the case because this principle, الضرر لا يزال بالضرر, harm is not removed by harm, is a constraint or restriction to the original primary principle, which is الضرر يزال. Harm is to be removed, so it acts as a restriction. So it's a derivative principle, that's why it's derivative. Another example, الرخص لا تناط بالمعاصي. Permissions do not apply to sins. Permissions do not apply to sins. And this is a restriction to the principle, which is also one of the 5 principles as well. المشقة تجلب اليسر. المشقة تجلب اليسر. Hardship brings ease. But this one, the primary principle, this one, المشقة تجلب اليسر, hardship brings ease, is restricted by الرخص لا تناط بالمعاصي. Permissions do not apply to sins. Let's give an example. Let's say someone is traveling, right? Someone is traveling, he's allowed, because we know this, yani from the adillah, we know that someone who's traveling, he's allowed to combine the prayers, right? He's allowed to combine the prayers, shorten them. He's allowed to wipe over his socks for 3 days and 3 nights for the traveler, 3 days and 3 nights, because this is hardship, and hardship brings ease. So Allah made for the traveler who is in a state of hardship ease by allowing him to do these things. But this is restricted by الرخص لا تناط بالمعاصي. Permissions do not apply to sins, or these permissions don't take effect or don't apply to someone who is upon sin. And in the example of the traveler, if he travels, let's say to commit zina, he travels to a land just to commit zina, then these permissions do not apply for him. These permissions don't apply for him. So this one, الرخص لا تناط بالمعاصي, is a restriction or constraint to the larger or primary rule, which is المشقة تجلب اليسر. Hardship brings ease, even though this principle, الرخص لا تناط بالمعاصي, is differed upon. But anyways, this is an example. And there are many other examples. So the point is, principles are counted as derivative principles if they are derived from other principles or act as constraints or restrictions to the primary ones. So these are secondary principles, and the primary are the ones that are the ones that which are not derived nor act as constraints for others. So they stand on their own. And the examples that I mentioned, the principles or the qawaid that I mentioned, are some of them are in the Shafi'i madhab, since I used Suyuti's book, which is a Shafi'i, like I mentioned, Al-Ashbah wal-Nadhair, a Shafi'i book, as a reference. So it's a good book to go back to read in this field, in field of Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyyah, Al-Ashbah wal-Nadhair by Suyuti. It's a good book to read, even though it's in the Shafi'i madhab. For the Shafi'iyya, it's a good book to read, and it's not only the Shafi'i madhab that only has this, by the way. I just use his as a reference because it's a good book. But other madhab also, they have books in Qawaid. The Hanafi madhab, the Maliki, the Hanbali, they also have books in the madhab. And inshallah, in the future, one of the videos will be mentioning the books of Qawaid for each madhab. So the Hanafi could go back to the Hanafi books, the Maliki to the Maliki books, the Hanbali to the Hanbali books, and the Shafi'i to the books of Shafi'iyya. We'll be mentioning what books are there in each madhab that talks about or mentions Al-Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyyah and related to it, inshallah. Now, we'll stop here, inshallah. These are the types of Al-Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyyah. We mentioned the three aspects in terms of its application, acceptance, and originality, and we elaborated on each and gave examples. And this is where we end off the types of principles, and then inshallah next lesson will be talk about where it's taken from and benefits, inshallah, or maybe it could be the where it's derived from in a separate video, and the benefits in a separate video. We'll see, inshallah, how long the video will be. So we'll stop here, inshallah, and continue in the upcoming videos with the introductory series. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. سبحانك اللهم بحمدك لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.